All right, we got double Sarahs today, so hence we've got Knutson and Parmar as the shortcuts. I am so excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it all day. Every time I do one of these, I learn that Flynn scholars have this superpower of finding a path that makes no sense on paper, yet somehow describes the person perfectly. And today we get to talk to Sarah, who's the Director of Conservation in Colorado Open Lands. So she lives in Colorado, just like I do. That's also very exciting. She's a fifth generation rancher from the border country of southeastern Arizona. She's an environmental economist by training, and she helped on the first groundwater conservation easement in the country, which we're going to learn about. And someone who also said no to a Fulbright because she realized she had something more important to do. We're going to talk about land, water, the West, and a lot of about her decisions that got her here. So, Sarah, I wanted to start with the place that made you in Arizona. Like I said, you told me before, you're fifth generation, your only child. You're on was it 20,000 acre cattle ranch in the very southeast corner of Arizona. I want you to paint us a picture of what did like a Tuesday look for you as your 10-year-old Sarah?
Ooh, that's a fun one. Well, as 10-year-old Sarah, my dad would wake up early every morning, and if I was not up early to help with chores on the ranch, like feeding animals, he would very loudly start clomping around in his cowboy boots. And then if that didn't work, the guilt trip would start. He'd stand outside my bedroom window and go, Sarah, the animals are hungry. Um, so the days always started with chores, but I love being outside. I love being with animals. It was a special place, but a very remote place. We
Mhm.
were very isolated from neighbors. Our nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and my parents made the choice. To turn down power lines coming to our ranch. So my parents installed one of the first solar systems in Arizona in the late 80s. And so we were kind of, off the grid and independent in a lot of ways and connected with our neighbors in many other ways in terms of shared labor. But growing up, we were 4 miles north of the Mexican border. And I think, as dynamics changed along the border as I was growing up, I was always very aware that, my life circumstances could have been incredibly different had I been born 4 miles south. Um,
Isn't that
and
wild? Yeah.
the privilege, that came with all of those, with being born on, on one side of the line. Um, Even though the landscape was very connected and the border community that I grew up in Douglas was very connected, very fluid for most of my life, where many of my classmates actually lived in Mexico and would drive across the border to attend school
Wow.
each day. So there was a lot of cultural connection, and yet there was this big stark line and now a big stark fence that provides a daily reminder of that division.
That makes sense. I didn't even think about the fact that there's a big fence there now. Growing up in Arizona, even way back when, and when I was young, that didn't exist. So speaking of the landscape there, you told me, and I think this is important for guiding your life. You told me about your parents helping start is it the Malpai Borderlands group? I did some research on it, and clearly it seems very legendary in that space as a model for getting ranchers, environmentalists to work together, which is a rare thing. And I think it looks like it came across as a case study of how to make things work. I'm curious about the dinner table conversations that you overheard as a kid that you didn't realize was unusual until much later, because they clearly guided your path.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, when you're a kid, whatever you're absorbed in, whatever your parents are doing, feels very normal. And so going to lots of community meetings as a child, I had like my set of coloring books and the things that I would bring to keep myself busy, but I absorbed a lot of conversation, and there was a lot of rhetoric, I would say, in the sort of more traditional agricultural meetings. Um, and then when my parents started kind of meeting with their neighbors to talk about the future of their community, of this area, in the face of this very large national environmental group, the Nature Conservancy, buying what had been a private ranch, was purchased by the Nature Conservancy, and this speared a lot of chatter, a lot of concern about what would become of that. Would this become public land? What would this look like? And this led to outreach with the Nature Conservancy. It was like, well, rather than, talking about what might happen, let's actually engage with them. And so I had folks from the national headquarters office of the Nature Conservancy, sleeping in our guest room and hanging out at dinner and talking about, all of the personal connections, and commonalities, that we have as human beings. And I think what I picked up from that was, wow, when you start from this relational foundation as people, and then you start talking about the things that you care about,
Different
these
things.
issues, you can get a lot further because you have this care for one another. You become more invested in, making things work for other people as well. I think when you can find that. But it took me some time, I think, to recognize that finding common ground didn't mean only focusing on things you had in common or smoothing over differences, but really approaching, those differences with acknowledgement, with curiosity, with humility, and with respect.
Makes sense. And you clearly use that later in your life. So I've never been to Douglas. You said that you love border culture. For people like me who've never spent time like living on a border, what do we miss when we think of a picture of the country from the outside? Like, how would you describe that space?
Yeah, I took for granted that not everyone's high school graduation was bilingual. That was something later that I went, oh wait, that's
That's
not everyone's
normal.
experience. Or, it was like, well, obviously September 14th there's going to be a huge celebration. There's, my town hosts fiestas. Like, there was just so much fantastic recognition of different holidays, of different cultural, celebrations and elements, and such a strong focus on family connections, that I found really beautiful, and just different as I moved away. Obviously, I'm Caucasian, and so I think growing up as the racial and ethnic minority in a place, it was just a very different experience. Even moving to Tucson from Douglas, um, and you know, unfortunately, there were some negatives. My high school at the time that I was attending had, I think, one of the highest teen pregnancy and dropout rates in the nation at the time. And um, so recognizing, the barriers that a lot of my classmates faced to finding a future that they really wanted, um, has been, just an important thing that I've held close, to never take for granted the opportunities that I had because of my particular family situation, family life, that were not the same as many of my classmates and other folks in my hometown.
Yeah, it's a lot more. We take for granted our homogeneity in lots of places. So jumping ahead to the Flynn scholarship, you told me that you were ready to bolt out of state, and Flynn played, a specific role in keeping you here, and it turned out to be a gift. What did staying in Arizona give you that you wouldn't have gotten somewhere else, do you think? It's hypothetical, but I'm curious what you think.
No, I so appreciate that. Yeah, I think I know this is not unique to agriculture. I'm sure anybody who's grown up with a family business and helping with a family business has understood both the joy and the level of expectation that can lay on your shoulders to carry that forward. And so there was a definitely a period of life where I just wanted to get away from that. That sort of expectation from that I felt from family that my path would be, to come back to this ranch and take over. And so I was definitely looking out of state, and the gift, so many gifts. One of those gifts was to get just enough distance to recognize that there was something special that I grew up with, and still be close enough to actually explore that with my parents and to maintain that connection and to actually give myself the space to see what that could look like. And then financially, I think we had land, which is an incredible gift. But as with many people in agriculture, we were kind of land rich, cash poor. And so I grew up with a degree of, financial fear. And so having the Flynn Scholarship, I think, really gave me the space to feel comfortable pursuing my passion in the nonprofit world and not worrying about, you know, taking debt into that with me, but having that space.
It's huge because I think, I mean, this happens to people who aren't grown-up farmers, but I attribute my growing up in a farming situation with my bag lady syndrome, is what I call it, is that, once you see your parents freak out about a hailstorm or something like that, and you're like, oh my God, are we not safe? Then you stay, you tend to get a lot more financial insecurities, and you get very grateful when a paycheck comes, that's for sure. Um, so jumping to Kenya, so you did two Flynn experiences abroad, and I'm interested in having you share with everyone because, like, most scholars, I guess I'm making a bit of a generality, but they feel pressure to stack every opportunity onto the resume. And in my case, I remember distinctly saying, you know what, I don't have time to do these fun or interesting courses in blank, like
Mhm.
archaeology or whatever. And so I specifically did it for that, and I knew I wasn't going to do anything in my career with it. Could you, because we have a lot of current scholars and past scholars on, I'd love for you to share why you gave yourself permission to go learn about art for 6 weeks when you were completely in a different space. You feel free to mention
Yeah.
Kenya because we are going to talk about Kenya.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one of my experiences was to Kenya. That was my second longer experience, but my first study abroad trip. I really wanted, I'm such a kind of, uh, this is the plan, this is the path. Um, Everything has to be in alignment kind of person. I wanted to give myself a little bit of permission to just do something fun and different. And so I chose to do a summer in Italy and take classes in art and archaeology and actually do some, apply some of that art class work and take that time to just be creative and do something that was not at all related to where I saw my career potential. And I'm so glad because yeah, how many times do you get a chance in life um, to just go explore and do something that doesn't have to feel like it has a purpose, where you can just explore and see, see where that takes you.
More of
Yeah.
that, more of that is preferred because it doesn't get easier the older you
No.
get to take those diversions. So, you know, you're just like every other fling that we talk about that you switch majors. And I know you start off in communications and you bailed. Can you just tell us a tiny bit about what you end up going into because it directly paves the way for your future and big decisions?
Yeah, yeah. When I was in high school, well, actually much before that, earlier on, I started competing in public speaking, which is the skill that my parents pushed me to develop. I was a very introverted only child, much more comfortable talking with adults than with my peers. And so just very soft spoken, very quiet. And I started competing in public speaking, and I love it now, and I'm so grateful. On Thursday night, I'm going to speak at our my work gala event to 300 people,
Yeah.
and to be able to do that confidently, or to be able to surprise people by using my voice effectively, feels like a little bit of a superpower, which is fun. But as I was discovering how much I enjoyed that, I thought, well, I don't really know exactly what I want to study in college, but since I am enjoying speaking and learning how to use my voice, communications sounds like a great place to start. And as I was just taking classes my first year, I was really drawn to a class on international trade and agriculture. And it was taught by a professor who had worked in international aid and development. And I was like, oh my gosh, like stop the bus. This is amazing. Um, I could use my background in agriculture and think about, how to make the world ideally a more equitable place. Um, Sign me up. And I was like, I am going to go work for the Food and Agriculture branch of the United Nations. Like, done, figured it out. Freshman year, bam. And so I went up to the professor at the end of class and was like, how does one get this job that you have done? And he was like, well, economics is a great is a great base for this kind of work. And so after my freshman year, I switched to economics and was really drawn to environmental and resource economics as this place that sort of acknowledges the structure of economics and the dynamics of our society, but also explores places where the market fails. And so that was really fascinating to me. Like, how do we create incentives for the kinds of things that we want to see in the world? A healthy environment, good resource choices, when the market doesn't necessarily support those things. So that definitely kind of sent me on a path of interest of, how do you create impact in the natural resource space.
So, which clearly you are, and we'll get into that more. That's working for you and for us, I would say. But so, when you switch majors, you graduate, I believe it was after the master's, because you wrapped that up fast. You did a speed version on the master's, and then you applied for the Fulbright to go back to Kenya, and you got it. Can you set for us the context of your life at that time and then walk us through the moment you got the offer? Like what you're feeling? And I'm going to follow up on this because I feel like it's very hard for anyone to achieve something that everyone in the world thinks is the most unbelievable thing and you do too, and then decide against it. So I'm going to take this in steps. But first, I'd like you to, like, when you got that offer, what was going on with you?
Yeah. So I finished I did finish my master's program quickly in a year instead of a couple of years. And in part, I wanted to do that to create a little bit of space to actually spend a little bit more time on my family's ranch before, whatever the next phase of life was. I was hoping before I moved to another country. Um, and so I'd applied for the Fulbright, was waiting to hear, was really enjoying kind of being on the ranch, reappreciating this group that my parents had helped start and the impacts that they were making, not only within our community, but as a model for what could be achieved by collaborative conservation work. And I got the acceptance letter, and I think because because I had taken a little bit of time for reflection, which I think is rare. I suspect for a lot of us, we're really high performing people, and the idea of, we're just there's constantly new ideas, there's constantly new activities, new projects, new goals to pursue. And I think because I took the time to kind of slow down for a minute, it gave me the space to, instead of just thinking like, well, of course, this is an incredible opportunity. This is the next, obviously, this is an exciting move. This is something that, is going to launch me on this trajectory that I had originally envisioned to do international work. I was able to kind of take the time to ask myself whether it was actually the right fit for me. Um, I think so often we get caught on like, is it the right move? And I think there's lots of potential right moves in our life. But is it the right fit in that particular space and time is a different type of question, and one that I'd never really allowed myself to ask. Um, and I had been in Kenya before on um, my second study abroad trip. And as part of that, I was a summer intern at a nonprofit organization that was looking at building economic opportunities for tribes to benefit from the tourism industry. And as a result, I got to meet some amazing Kenyans working in this organization. And I was reflecting on how challenging it was for them to secure jobs in this space, to do this work, and how incredibly impactful they were because they knew, the relationships, the social systems, the dynamics of communities there. And I thought, instead of going to this place where I could have fantastic impact. I know I would certainly learn a lot more. That would be a great option. But could I potentially have even greater impact if I use that the within a context that where I already have some of those relationships, some of that dynamics, some of that knowledge of social and political dynamics, could I actually, apply those skills close to home and be a lot more effective at what I'm hoping to achieve in life? Um, so that was the decision that I made.
You weren't like an old soul, but I think you were thinking like an old soul. I mean, I struggle myself like right now, like giving myself I'm like, should I give myself permission just to work on this one idea I have all summer? And it's a struggle, it's really a struggle to let yourself have perceived free time when the world's like moving 180 miles an hour. So I think that was just fantastic that you were wise enough to think that way. So onto like your next 18 years. You told me that the Flynn, because you came out of school debt free like all of us, we were able to have a lot more choices. And you took a low paying fellowship, and a lot of fellowships are very low paying, and some people just can't do it because this is also the same time where some people want to have kids and buy a house, all that kind of stuff. Um, and you're still there, the same place, right? And
I
so
am 18 years later,
18 years
which is,
later, so it seems to be a good choice. So 18 years at one organization in a world that has been incentivizing young people to jump every 2 years. Can you make the case for that? Um, how you don't become stagnant? Like how have you been able to stay in one organization that long?
yeah, I mean, some of it was certainly luck. But what I think I realized about the nonprofit world, which is kind of funny because I would never see myself necessarily as an entrepreneurial person. Um, and yet, what I realized in the nonprofit world was, wow, like if I can find, a cool idea to pursue and convince a funding entity that this is a cool idea to pursue, um, there will be space for me to do that. And so I actually fundraised to keep my job after my fellowship ended. Um, I had started working with a really unique community of small scale self-identified family farmers in a certain part of Colorado, and realized, wow, the state does not understand how these folks are operating and how they're using their water rights in these really unique ways. And what an incredible like cultural asset this is, but also what an incredible model of water use this is. And so I was like, I want to figure out how to support this community to move forward, to be viable, to advocate for themselves, and was able to raise grant funds to do that and convince my organization to keep me on um, in a position to keep working with this community. And over time, that just continued to grow. And it was like, wow, if you can build, again, my philosophy has always been the best conservation comes from conversation. And so getting to understand what local needs, local visions, local challenges were um, has just led to really fun, cool, kind of ground up solutions and problem solving. And that I think just never gets old. So I've gotten to, so I grew from kind of working in one particular part of the state with one community to becoming my organization's statewide director of our primary program about 12 years ago now. So I was very fortunate because I got to become part of the organizational leadership fairly early on. And so that's really given me the space to be in this really cool kind of place within the organization where I have a lot of creative autonomy to think about how we shape our work and our impact. Um, and yet, I don't necessarily have to be the person like doing all of the organizational fundraising and, um, managing our board of directors and things like that. So I feel like I really found that like sweet spot of, I get to have a lot of influence over the type of work that not only I do, but that we do as an organization at a statewide level. And and that's just grown into lots of different opportunities to sit on state commissions, to participate in federal policy. I got invited by one of the Colorado senators uh, to participate in a Senate Farm Bill hearing a couple of years ago to share ideas. And so it's just been really exciting to think about, can you find an organization or a job space that's the right cultural fit for you, where you can really be yourself and have the space to explore ideas. And I think if you can find that, that kind of space, then you get to take that in all kinds of directions. So
You
it's
think
yeah.
that's a function of, I don't know how big the organization is, but in terms of nonprofits, I'm sure size has some sort of correlation to bureaucracy or inverse maybe an inverse relation to ability to, create your own path. Do you have a feeling on that? Because I know a lot of people in the Flynn community are very interested in the nonprofit world. Can you give a little guidance on maybe things to look for versus things to avoid?
Yeah. So for me, I describe my size of nonprofit as like the Goldilocks. It's not so small that there's not resources and support for things like professional development or, a living wage, which is helpful. Um, but it's not so big that there are all of these layers of decision making and bureaucracy that you can't be kind of nimble and responsive. So the nonprofit I work for is about 30 people. I manage a team of 8 folks, and I think it's a really fun size, in my
That's cool.
opinion. Yeah.
So just to warn everybody, I'm going to open up to Q&A in like a little over 5 minutes. So start prepping your questions, though I have at least 2 hours worth of things that I want to ask. But luckily she doesn't live far away, so I can chase her. Um, I'm curious because we're like the full West is in a drought right now, and it's not just Colorado. And it's hard. I mean, there's a lot of hot takes all the time, and water rights and things about water are very contentious when there's a drought. I'm curious what you think, and I'm gonna ask you. I have a whole bunch of questions again, so I'm just gonna go for like, the fast answer format. What do you think policymakers are getting right versus wrong in this space? Is there a short version of this that coming from someone who knows, because you're the person who knows?
That is a really good, tough question. I think that the challenging picture for water is the same as the challenging picture that we see in a lot of areas of policy, which is that there is, I would say, more loyalty to constituency than there is to problem solving.
Mm.
Um, and so I think, you take the Colorado River, for example, everyone feels more loyalty to being able to show their state that they are standing up for their state in the negotiations than they are to thinking about how we create a functional living
Right.
river um, that can serve the most people with the least harm. Um, and so I think there's a direction that I hope we can move, which is how do we acknowledge scarcity? How do we share scarcity? How do we compensate folks who belong to tribes who've never received the allocation of water that they should have and are entitled to? Um, and how do we create the right mix of certainty and flexibility? Because we all need, a level of certainty that we're going to be able to have drinking water, for example. Um, but we need to be able to shift water uses to support a functional river when we are going to be looking at a smaller river future.
Yeah, I mean, it's real. I'm looking out the window at our reservoir, and it's a real issue. And I didn't realize, like, even here, which had to be some serious Wild West, there dates of water rights that are in like early 1800s, and people are looking them up and making sure that they have them. So it's a tricky one. I have two more questions and I'll open it up. But on that same similar topic, you said land people and water people live in different worlds, even though they're
Mhm.
inseparable. What do water people miss about land, and what do land people miss about water? If they're in that kind of dimension space.
Yeah, I think coming from more of a land use, land conservation background from my organization, it was really eye-opening to me when I kind of had this aha moment of like, oh my gosh, we can restrict land use in certain ways, but it's the decisions that we as a society are making about our water resources that are going to shape landscapes at a very large scale for the foreseeable future. And so I think we were really, when you're developing then incentives for people to make decisions that are very focused on one of those resources or the other, you're missing that interaction between the two things.
Symbiotic, yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think, for folks who are in the water world, it was maybe, a lack of understanding of the types of decisions that people were needing to make regarding their land use. Like, what crop am I going to plant? Am I going to apply, you know, X amount of water or Y amount of water to that? But I have to make that based on a land use decision. And for land folks like me, it was going, oh my gosh, the way that cities acquire water is to buy farmland and dry it up and move that water to the cities. And so, unless and until we create a different market for them to acquire water, perhaps on a much more temporary basis, but at the scale that they needed it to supply to their residents, then we are going to keep kind of pulling the economic and ecological building blocks out of these rural areas. And so it's like, how do we think about what everybody needs, and how do we think about sharing this resource rather than creating these pathways that are going to set us up for an either or future where there's winners and
Yeah,
losers.
it's an economist situation in the sense of the incentives, right? The short term constituency problem that you mentioned. For people who, their job is to make their constituents happy, and if they represent cities versus the fewer, sparsely populated rural areas, it's set up for a real tricky situation. I know I have to hand it over to everybody else, but my last little thing is, so Sarah gave her job almost a 15-year notice that she was going to leave. And that's, I think you said when your son graduates from high school, which is around what, 2031, 5, 6 years or something from now. So this is like the longest, notice period I've ever heard anywhere. And I'll leave the audience can ask questions about this, but I'm most curious, is that, you know, when you actually move home and move, way back into like, more isolated space and in a total different world, what do you think you're going to gain and what do you think you're going to give up?
Yeah. Um, I'm really excited uh, to be back on the ranch because I do think I was thinking a lot about how we relate to land. And, I've kind of been on both sides now of the rural urban divide. And when you're in the city, the way I love nature now is from this place of awe and as kind of a respite from everyday life. When I'm on the ranch, nature is everyday life, and there's a love of the land that's totally inseparable from vulnerability, because you're so dependent on, kind of what Mother Nature does, and you're very connected to that kind of climactic reality. And I think getting to think about how to steward a piece of the earth well um, is something that feels like a huge honor. And I don't take for granted that as someone who stands to kind of inherit property that is just a huge gift that not a lot of people have the opportunity to do. So I'm excited to think about what that looks like. And and I'm a little bit afraid of the change of pace, to be honest. I have gotten used to like, ooh, how do I have my fingers in, you know, 20 different exciting projects and things. And, I'm working on a project that blends conservation and a housing community for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the metro area. And I'm thinking about, how we restore aquifers in the West. And I get to like jump and play across lots of different topics in my current job. And so it's both exciting and a little bit scary to think about, to your point, like, okay, we're doing this now.
Like, and like selfishly, I'd be like, I'll if I have to drive 45 minutes for a fountain Diet Coke, I'm gonna be really sad. Maybe you can run some like, get some Flynn ranch hands by having little retreats, and then you can have like seminar series or thing just to throw some ideas out there. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to everyone. And like Anne said at the beginning, feel free to raise your hand. Hopefully I will be able to see. If not, like, sometimes I don't see all the people on the same screen. But throw in the chat like, hey, I have a question. And you can also say, Sarah, will you ask this question? Meaning this Sarah. Mia has a question already. Great. That was really easy, Mia.
Um, Hi, Sarah. First off, I'm gonna be slightly weird, which is kind of the only way I know how to be and be like super fangirl. I don't know if you remember me. I was the class before you. But I'm also from Cochise County. I'm not super far from the border, but Sierra Vista is very different from Douglas, but still a lot of what you said resonates with me so much. It's very cool to see you and hear about your life. And all of this is very, very cool. Um, Congratulations and thank you for being here. And I don't know, I now just want to like be your new best friend. Um,
Sign
you
me up.
very cool.
Fangirl right back. And of course, I remember you. So, yes, I totally want to connect about Southeastern Arizona now
Yeah,
and all the things.
that would be awesome. Although I live in the Midwest and it is very, very different than home for sure. My question is, as AI continues to grow and there's all of this talk about data centers and their energy usage and their water usage, how do we try to or actually ensure that we are making responsible policy choices from a conservationist lens, when there's just so much like capitalistic pressure to kind of let them run unchecked. There's so much, social pressure, like through the winter, like every colleague I know is like, here is my picture of AI, like putting me into like a sparkly tinsel jumpsuit. I'm like, what? Why do we need this, guys? And my colleagues who are all like super smart people were like, what do you mean like AI negatively impacts the environment? And like people who it feels like should know these things are like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Mia. Um, and so I guess my question is like, what do we do? Because this clearly is a train that has left the station in many ways.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's such a great question and such an awesome example of that like land use, water use intersection. And I totally feel like AI is going to be the next, it's that wave of like, oh, fast fashion has impacts. Like, oh, all these plastics that we've put out into the world have impacts. Where it feels like, unfortunately, it takes us, a generation or two to recognize that what is easy and shiny is not always um, what is the best option for us as human beings or the earth that we depend on. And I really appreciate, I think there's a group here in Colorado, and I can't remember if they're national, Warm Cookies of the Revolution. I don't know if anybody has heard of this group. It's like the funniest
Fun
name,
name.
but they are really focused on how, like, in this age where it is so easy to get apathetic about politics, like, how do we focus our energy in a different direction, and especially in local civic engagement, where, you actually can talk to other human beings, and you can share information, and you can, actually have an impact on things that affect your everyday life. And so I think that bringing this type of conversation to um, to counties in particular, where a lot of these land use permitting decisions are being made to attract or to allow data centers, is a really fantastic way to stand up for, accountability of resource use, to say, okay, if you are proposing a data center in my community, what exactly is your water footprint going to be? Where is that going to come from? How are you going to support a healthy cycle of water within this community? And I think there are ways that data centers are demonstrating an ability to do that, but not unless they have to.
Stu.
So I do
Mhm.
think there's opportunities there.
Awesome. Okay, we've got three questions lined up.
Okay.
I'm Adrian, Andrea, and Paul. So I'm going to start with Adrian since you were next on the. And forgive me if I pronounce anyone's names incorrectly. Just say it the right way because I know I have an Andrea, an Ondrea, and Andrea friends. So when we get to you, please tell me the right one. Adrian.
Hi, Miss Parmar. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I sure can.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for all your insights. I really enjoyed listening to it all. Um, my question is mainly correlated to one of your quotes you said just now that I think really resonated with me. That being like that there should be a shift away from conservation and more towards conversation with people in Arizona. And I think during this section you were talking about how you had to work with Hispano-speaking men and women. And one thing you mentioned there, from what I believe, is that there's at least creative solutions that would work towards uplifting these silent voices, shifting towards conversation. So, as something that's also curious about having strategies to implement about uplifting these silent voices in our community, I just want to ask you a quick question about like what were these strategies on the state level that people are, or that Arizona as a whole is implementing to uplift these voices to manifest more conversation in our community.
I so appreciate that question.
Thank you.
I have to apologize because I haven't been an adult in Arizona since for a long time. So I can speak to strategies in Colorado that I would love to see. And I just don't know enough about the water conversations that are or aren't happening within Arizona to be able to speak to that intelligently. Maybe others on this can. But within Colorado, um, there were a couple of things. One was going to the state legislature to actually pass an acknowledgement law. So we have across the West, a unique system of water rights that's based typically on who put something to use first. Um, and there's a very, kind of strict administration of that. And what this particular community was doing was outside of that legal system and structure. And so it was um, going to the state legislature to actually pass a recognition law that highlighted the unique cultural approach that they were taking to resource use and to make it legal, one, and then to actually start working with universities, with other institutions to um, to draw attention to how this functional shared scarcity could really be a model for the rest of us, for the for other water users within the state. So I think it was kind of taking some of those practices, and I think about so much indigenous stewardship is about connection to place, as opposed to, sort of utilitarian consumption. And there's so much we can learn from that. And so there's power in, I think, telling those stories, recognizing, acknowledging that. And we have a statewide water plan that was developed a few years ago. And that took regional voices and stories and actually kind of rolled them up to that statewide level. And so I think that has also helped kind of bring some of those more silenced or unheard voices to the forefront to actually provide a venue to participate in those decisions and conversations.
Awesome. Andrea?
Hi there, my name is Andrea. Thank you
Andrea,
so
see?
much. Thank you so much for this conversation, Sarah. A little bit of context about myself. I'm a PhD student studying private land ownership on the US-Mexico border.
Oh my
So I
gosh.
really enjoyed hearing about your background, about your family history, and learned a lot from that part of the conversation. As somebody who is interested in private land ownership and property rights and how, this sort of like legal mechanism gives individuals sort of the ability to shape politics, I'm curious about how in your work, with, landowners or as a conservation proponent, what role private landowners or property owners have to play in sort of bringing forth systems level changes that are necessary to do things like enact a conservation program.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And I think there's a natural tension that exists, that I certainly acknowledge as somebody who benefited from the Homestead Act of the United States, which essentially, gave people, families, rights to own land as if there was no one there before. Given the society, the political system that we have now, I do think that there are so many private landowners who do feel a connection or responsibility to resources. Um, and because so many times there is kind of a political avenue for those folks to be able to unite and raise their voices, I do think that there's a level of personal investment and commitment that can be shared to kind of bring about these landscape scale changes or these policy changes. I do think that there is a struggle. My husband used to work for a group called the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, which really represents more family scale agricultural producers. And I do think that there's a shift that happens when land and water becomes so valuable that it can only be affordable to those who don't necessarily have to make a living from that land. Because I think the incentives change, the connection changes, that vulnerability to climate changes. And so I do think that there's a special kind of power in my mind that comes from folks who have that kind of level of personal vulnerability that makes them passionate about change and using um, that resource gift that they have to effectuate that change.
Thanks. Paul, you're next.
Hi, Sarah. Glad to meet you. Thanks for your good work. And I think that our ancestors were probably neighbors. They were in Turkey Creek in the 1880s. So uh, would love to meet you and talk about all that at some point in time. My question, though, is about a couple things that you mentioned earlier on, particularly when market solutions fail, but also like what you learned from the farmers that you worked with early on in terms of their alternative approaches to water, or maybe even in Kenya, other uses or approaches to water or natural resources, other commons, and what, if any, lessons that might suggest for our shared futures. Thank you.
Ooh, thanks, Paul. I so appreciate that question. I think that for me, there's two questions. There's, what is the context that we operate in within our country, politically, economically, and how do we think about incentives that drive people, to make investments that think about the long term rather than the short term for our resources. And I think about the actual sort of functional use of resources, um, and the people who are making decisions. And I think that with so many things, when we have functional human communities where we can speak to each other, where we can become invested in each other and in a place, we are more likely to make those kinds of decisions. And the further away that we get from that, the harder that that becomes. And so, in my mind, there's these sort of two scales that we need to think about. And the more we can contribute to those like healthy community dialogues where we are finding that common ground, where we are thinking about how to, what we want our lives and our children's and grandchildren's lives to look like and what opportunities we want them to have. I think the more that we can come together around those kinds of visions as communities and think about how to problem solve with that future in mind, the more that we can shape the kinds of decisions that will then roll into the types of policies and incentives that can support those types of decisions that people want to make. I don't know
And
if
it's
that
just
totally answered your question, Paul, but I look forward to talking more.
it's just a hard one, and it's like you mentioned it kind of wove through the conversation, which is, you know, having voices for individuals and getting all of them to talk together. And we unfortunately, like you said, the bus that's left the station or the train that's left the station is that we have, a lot of anonymous interactions now, and we are getting even more of that as time goes. And I honestly think I feel like the pendulum always swings. And I do feel like that we are seeing signs of the swing toward community building again. I'm seeing that in lots of different places. And even big companies are making purchases of other big companies that are community builders. So I have hopes that we're all going to work together. We just ran out of time, so I just want to say thank you so much, Sarah, for being on this call with me and helping all of us understand so much more about your space. Thank you, thank you.